Father, we're not used to being warned with grave and weighty judgments. We like to often think of your mercy, your kindness. We like to think upon your beauty, your goodness. And yet we've been trained to avoid the hard words. The words that sting, the words that warn, the words that are weighty. So God, we minimize the glorious things, the merciful things, the beautiful things, by minimizing the horrible things, the terrifying things. So God, I pray today that you would wield this text, that we would see the weight of sin at the heart of this text, the heart of Eli and Eli's sons. That we'd see the horror of your judgments against this family. And we'd be overwhelmed with the glory and the beauty of what you promise to give. Not just in Samuel, but through it in your Son. So God, I pray that we would tremble and that we would marvel. That we'd be afraid, we'd sing in the face of your promises. In your name we pray. Amen. We talked last week, actually the last 2 weeks, as we've started this series, working our way through 1 and 2 Samuel, that at the heart of this book, we don't know what the whole story is about, what the whole overarching direction of what God is giving us in 1 and 2 Samuel, that what you're going to see is the story of Israel in shambles, Israel facing the judgment of God, Israel actually collapsing as a society, as a people who belong to the Lord, collapsing, and then precisely in the midst of that collapsing, not as an alternative to it, not as something that just, okay, this happened, let's try again, but rather because it was God's intention, because it was God's purpose, God took that collapse, took that devastation, took that rebellion, took that judgment, and right in the middle of it begins to rebuild, restore his people. And actually to rebuild something better than what they had before. That built into the promises of this story, this narrative, in the heart of 1 and 2 Samuel, it is the seed that gets planted, out of which will grow Jesus and the kingdom, and all the nations of the earth being gathered to King Jesus to worship him forever and ever and ever. And this is the kind of story God loves to tell. A story of brokenness, a story of apparent, absolute, abject failure. And in the face of it, him actually using that failure, using that death, using that collapse to bring about resurrection. To bring life where there has only been death. To bring joy where there's been nothing but sorrow and hard-heartedness. That's what this story in the end is about as we journey through 1 Samuel 1 all the way to the end of 2 Samuel over the next 32 years. Just joking. But one of the things that's difficult if we set out on that kind of journey over the next several months is the challenge of the fact that as we look at a story about the collapse of the people of God, the complete collapse of worship, of the concept of justice, of right rule, as we look at that story, if we're going to tell that story, if we're going to walk faithfully through that story, then I'll just say this, I'm going to be tempted, as we work our way through this book, to skip chapters like the second half of chapter 2. Because what you have at the second half of chapter 2 is the story of the judgment of God, an unbelievably severe judgment coming against a family. What we see here is darkness. What we see here is the judgments of God against sin. Sin that, admittedly, I don't think we always understand as we hear this story, and they like a little more fat on their meat. But sin that was horrible, and the judgment of God which is more terrifying. And I think like the reason why I as a pastor would be tempted to skip over sections of the Bible like this one, particularly as we work our way, because there's a lot of them in 1st and 2nd Samuel, is I think that we've been trained, particularly in a secular society, to see religion, to see the Bible, to see that the purpose of Christianity is to give us comforting feelings. Maybe a handful of bits of practical advice on how to do day-to-day life. But what we haven't been told is, no, actually the goal, the purpose of our gathering, the purpose of our meditating on the Scriptures is that we would see God. That we would see Him for who He is. See, the purpose of Christianity is not culture war. It's not to make you kind of have a better equipped life and steps to a better life. At the end of the day, the very essence of what it means to be the people of God and what we gather in this room is that we would see Him. We would see Him as He actually is. That we would know Him as He actually is above everything else in life. At the very foundation of what it means to be the people of God is an absolute resolve that in Jesus Christ I would gaze upon the God of the universe. I would see Him for who He is. The scary parts, the beautiful parts, the parts that are undoing, the parts that lead us to tremble, to put our hands over our mouth and say, what in the world is this God? Who can stand before Him? And also to see the parts that cause us to fall on our face in joy as we marvel at His grace. So when we come to a chapter 2, where God sovereignly brings about destruction, the absolute destruction of a family, we would seek God. Not what we find emotionally satisfying. Not what we find maybe comforting. Maybe not what we would find practically that helpful. Oh, but I would plead with you. Resolve in your hearts to see the God who is there. The God who is actually there. God who has actually acted and spoken. That He might be known and worshipped and feared and loved. See Him. So may we consider together the terrible judgments of God. And ask the question, what is He up to in the midst of all of it? And may we hold on to that question. May we hold on to that purpose in the midst of a culture that tends to say that whatever religion is, it's certainly not worth dying over. It's certainly not worth being ostracized about. It's certainly not worth having any anxiety about. If it's not personally helpful or satisfying, we should have nothing to do with it. In the midst of a culture like that, I pray that we would say with C.S. Lewis, I would see God. Not my idea of God, not my desire for what God should be like, but that we as a people would say in the midst of the world, I will see Him. Even His judgments. Let's consider His judgments. I'll look at this in 3 phases. Here's your preacher's 3-point sermon, which will quickly turn into a 17-point sermon, of which you won't be able to discern the points. First, I want us to consider what are the actual sins happening here in Eli's house. So, the judgment that we're going to see in the back half of this chapter is terrible. Absolutely terrible. But what sins are actually going on? We're going to get 2 phases. What do they do? What does it mean? Because there's actually some meaning in this text, some hints at what's actually motivating these actions, the meaning of the action. So there's what they actually did, and then there was what they did meant. So there's 2 different things. And so I want us to look at both of those. And second, what is the judgment that God brings against Eli's house? Why does he bring it? And then third, where the chapter ends. If God is going to wipe out the family of priests, the ones that were meant to stand before God, representing the people of God, the ones that are supposed to stand before the people of God, representing God, if God's going to wipe them out, as he promises to do in this text, then that creates a massive crisis. A massive crisis. A crisis that, if left unresolved, will lead to the disintegration of the worship of Yahweh on the earth. Please hear the weight of that. If the priests go away, there will be no worship of God on the earth in this day, in this iteration of the covenant. So when this threat lands on Eli and his sons, it's not just a problem for them. It's actually a problem for us. So how does God deal with that problem? Because he doesn't leave that problem unsolved or unaddressed in this text. So first, the sins of Eli's house. First, you'll notice that they eat the fat. There's no problem with fat. Please hear that. It's very important. You should eat lots of fat. But these priests, how the way the sacrifices worked, is that animal sacrifices were brought before the Lord, and however the sacrifices were to be presented, they were to burn in such a way that the fat belonged to God. So, be comforted before we get into the hard judgment stuff. If you are a person who likes to eat the fat, you are like God. And so, that is how sacrifices and worship function within Israel. Sacrifices were brought to God, and the fat, God says, the fat belongs to me. That's mine. I want the fat in the burnt offering. I want the fat in the animal sacrifices. That is what comes to me, and then a portion of the animal sacrifices, but not the fat, would then be given to the priests. It would be the portion that the priests themselves were allowed to eat and consume. And so, but rather than allowing that to happen, these two sons, Phinehas and I can't should have written it down. Hophni. Great name. I'll remember that from now on. Phinehas and Hophni are taking for themselves the fat and eating it. This fat belongs to the Lord. We also see that they are sleeping with, and the ESV translates it, the women at the tabernacle who were serving at the tabernacle. These are actually virgins that served at the tabernacle. They are seducing and sleeping with the women, the virgins who are serving at the entrance to the tabernacle. So you have those two sins. The third sin is you have Eli's rebuke. You might wonder, why is that a sin? We've got two very high-handed sins being performed by priests in the worship of Israel. And the Father comes in addressing those sins. I want you to listen carefully to the nature of his rebuke. And he said to them, verse 23, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. And if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? They would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death." I think the sin implicit in this paragraph is that Eli didn't rebuke his sons with any measure of strength or clarity. But one of the realities is in this rebuke is it's just a vague, hey, stop doing evil things. I'm hearing from other people you're doing bad things. This might offend the Lord. Don't do evil things. If you offend the Lord, who will intercede for you? There lacks specificity. Stop doing this. Stop stealing the fat from the Lord. Stop having sex with the women, the virgins who serve at the tabernacle complex. Stop doing this. Start doing this. There is in Eli's rebuke no strength because there's no specificity. And I think this is how we, just as a little rapture, I'll go rapture. This is how we've learned to address sin in our day and age. Whether it's fathers with sons, or is the church speaking in the midst of a culture? We don't speak with specificity, because the moment you begin to speak with specificity, then the reality is that things get uncomfortable. Because you start actually talking about real behaviors, real actions, real attitudes that the person in front of you might actually have. And so if I address it with any measure of specificity, I risk offending the person I'm talking to. Or I risk them having the strange notion that I would ever condemn, or that God would ever condemn, a certain set of practices, a certain set of behaviors. And so we talk in vague, sweeping notions about the nature of sin, and we refuse to address it with specificity. We refuse to say about people's behaviors what God would say about those behaviors. Maybe we do it because we're afraid of being seen as unloving. Maybe we avoid it because we're afraid of looking proud or as a judge. But all that stems from a pretty remarkable misunderstanding of the meaning of humility. See, I don't stand in judgment over anyone. Rather, it's God with us. And humility and love requires me to speak with clarity and precision and say what God says about things. It is no help to my son or to my daughter if I don't address with specificity and clarity their sin, their behaviors, their actions. I mean, think about it this way. So, we lived on a very, very busy street when we first moved to Denver, Colorado. Federal Boulevard. Very busy street. My friends who live on Federal Boulevard as well. We had a fence around the yard. Sometimes we would go outside of our yard. And we had little kids, and we needed to be, it would not be clear or strong or helpful for me to tell my 4-year-old, hey, just, stick around the house. Like, just vaguely, generally, you just stay close to the house. What is close to me? I mean, in the middle of Federal Boulevard, it's relatively close. We moved from Texas, so it's way closer than Texas. It lacks specificity, it lacks clarity. Now, what my son particularly needed to hear at age 4 was like, hey, do you see this sidewalk? Don't go on the other side of this sidewalk. Like right here. Do you see this gate? Do not open the gate and go outside of it if you're not with mom or dad or someone else is with you. An adult over the age of 18, exactly, is with you. Great specificity. Do you see the difference? I'm not actually helping him understand what he's doing wrong if I'm not actually providing real clarity of the lines he should cross and not cross. I'm not serving and loving my son if when he's 4, he kind of wanders out into the middle of Federal, and I haven't provided any boundaries, and I just come off and fly off the handle. Like, that's not good. But what if I did that? Well, what if out of nowhere, like Carson, she's 3, one day just decides, you know what? I like that little bean in the middle of Federal. There's like flowers growing there. I want to see a flower. So she begins to wander out of our gate. I've never said anything about don't go outside of the gate. I've never said anything about don't go across the sidewalk. I've never said anything about don't go on the street. She wanders across the street, and I find her in the middle boulevard, whatever those things are in the middle of the street. She's just picking flowers. Everything seems great. And I come out the front door freaking out, just screaming and yelling and flying off the handle. And just yelling at her about how foolish this was and how stupid this is. That wouldn't be loving, would it? And what if in the end, like, I didn't tell her to go outside of the gate because I was afraid that she might think I was being very legalistic. 3-year-old daughter, tell her, hey, don't go outside of that gate. Concerned, she might think that the basis of my love for her is on whether or not she goes outside of the gate. Concerned about legalism, so I don't tell her about the gate. That's not love. And this at one level is what Eli does with his sons. They're in flagrant disobedience against God in very, very specific ways. They're facing harsh and terrible judgments from the God of the earth. And Eli, rather than very specifically telling them, hey, this is what you're doing, this is what the judgment of God will come against. He says, hey, people are saying that you guys are doing really terrible things. Stop it. Even the emphasis on that. And here's stuff. Like people are talking about what you guys do. You need to stop doing stuff. So they're eating the fat, sleeping with the virgins who serve at the temple. The weakness of their father's rebuke. And then I want you to notice this. In verse 12, it said, now the sons of Eli were worthless men. That this is the exact, another way to translate this phrase would be to say that the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. It's the name that the scriptures give to Satan. The embodiment of wickedness and worthlessness. Which is an interesting little piece to consider. Like the parallel of the Hebrew of that verse is to say that they're sons of Eli, meaning they're sons of Belial. Which is wild if you consider Eli isn't like that bad of a character in these chapters. The text is clearly wanting to point to this idea that these wicked sons are sons of worthlessness. That Eli has been a worthless father to them. What does all this mean? The first clue as to what this all means, what's actually underneath this. Is God really going to wipe out a family, destroy the priesthood because of sex and fat? There's actually more going on even than meets the eye. So the first clue to what's happening here is the name of Eli's son, Phinehas. He's actually named after a character in the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, Israel's coming into the promised land, and they're beginning to prepare themselves to enter the promised land. They're surrounded by pagan nations. As they're surrounded by pagan nations, here's what happens. And it keeps happening to the people of God throughout all of history. The worship of God and the instructions on what it means to be the people of God, worshiping God, begins to blend together with the paganism, the idolatry in the surrounding cultures. And one of the things that was central to that particular pagan culture was sex was an act of worship, an act of prayer. Public sex happening in the temple before the idols. And so Israel, you can imagine that kind of just took off for Israel. That was a big addition to the worship services. And so that begins to take place in Israel's worship before Yahweh. And God begins to wipe out the people of God. He begins to bring judgment. And as judgment is beginning to come and fall, and people are dying, a man named Phinehas sees another man bringing a pagan woman into the camp, into the place where God dwells, into the place where Israel had gathered, seeking forgiveness, seeking that God would purify them of their idolatry. He brings a woman into the camp and begins to have relations with her. And then Phinehas, grabbing a spear, kills them both. And that ends the plague that's wiping out Israel. The heart of the problem that Phinehas, the old Phinehas, the Phinehas from Numbers, is trying to solve is this idea that worship had been corrupted. The worship of God had been turned into this kind of blending of worshiping idols and worshiping God. And the old Phinehas was a zealous man who put an end to it. But Eli's Phinehas, his son Phinehas, was not a zealous man. He actually corrupted worship in the exact ways that Phinehas was fighting. So it gives us a clue that, hey, the weight of what's actually unfolding with Eli and his sons isn't merely around a set of actions, but those actions are tethered to the meaning and the corruption, the worship of all of God's people. The problem at the heart of this is God, and how they were treating God, and how their worship had become about something other than God. So what do we make of the virgins? Well, the virgins serving at the tent of meeting, it wasn't just, hey, we need extra hands here to serve, let's go find some virgins. For they're really good at serving at the tabernacle. The idea is that the virgins represented holiness, the holiness of the place in which they served. They were those who welcomed travelers. They were those who served and took care of the outside of the tent of meeting. But they also represented the inviolability of the Holy of Holies. They represented the untouchableness of the holiness of God. In other words, they weren't just serving a particular function. They represented a reality in what it means to come before the presence of the living God. You don't just waltz in there. You certainly don't do with it whatever you want. No, He is holy. He is inviolable. He is absolutely untouchable. And the service of these women was meant to be a visual reminder to the people of God of the holiness of God, of the beauty of God, of the glory of God. So to take these women and to sleep with them is a mockery, a foundational mockery of what God Himself is saying to the people of God at the heart of their worship. And last, stealing fat from the Lord. What's that? It's a subversion of worship itself. It's actually taking the whole purpose and meaning of worship. Worship is supposed to be, and flipping it on its head. It was putting myself centered. My satisfaction, my desires, what I want, as the central meaning of what's supposed to be happening in worship. But rather than putting God and His glory and His name and His desires and what delights Him at the center of worship. The past 60 years in American evangelicalism, an experiment has been tried. That experiment has placed at the center of the meaning of worship phrases like worship experience, but with the considerations of worship pastors and directors and productions. It's placed at the center of our worship you, me. We've taken the fat for ourselves. But we've made the center of worship, in some cases, politics. And lots and lots and lots of cases, you and your emotional experience. We've subverted the center of what the worship of the church is to be about, namely God. God and His glory, His name, and His renown. That we would find our joy in Him, that we would find our hope in seeing and beholding Him. That the task that we engage in here on a Sunday morning would not be to come and be entertained. It would not be to simply come and feel good, but rather the task, the vocation of what we do in this room every Sunday is that we would gather here, that our lives and our songs and our worship and our prayers would be a sweet aroma in the presence of God. When we gather in this room, our worship is for Him. Our singing is for Him. Our prayers are for Him. This sermon is for Him. Because even as we gather at this table is for Him. And the beauty of what we've been called to do is this is precisely how God feeds us and nourishes us and cares for us. When all of our affections and attention is fixed on God. The priest, Eli's house, whose sole job in the world was to facilitate that kind of worship among the people of God, subverted it completely. So God pronounces a fearful judgment on Eli's house. Your sons will die, your house will pass out in the priesthood altogether. The promise given in the Exodus that your house would minister before me, be a house set apart to be the means by which the people of God would worship God. Well, that would stop. In fact, a day will come in which I will keep members of your household alive only so that they might be humbled by begging for some of the wealth and riches and blessing that I'm going to bring to my people. They will be lightly esteemed, he says, because they have hated me. And this phrase, lightly esteemed, doesn't mean, in the original, doesn't mean that you could be greatly esteemed, but instead you'll be like half esteemed. It means you'll be regarded lightly, or be regarded with no regard at all. It's a statement of shame. In bringing this judgment on Eli's house, here is God's representative to the people. And here is the representative of the people of God, God Himself. Here is the sole mechanism by which people can worship God and come to His presence. Here's the sole mechanism by which people can go and their sins can be atoned for and dealt with. Here's the sole mechanism by which the law of God can be taught with authority and beauty and goodness to the people of God. God has just promised to wipe them out. You see the problem? The crisis at the heart of this judgment. Now listen to the Lord. Verse 35. And I, God, you see that? I will raise up for myself a faithful priest. He shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. And everyone who is left in your house shall come to implore him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, shall say, please put me in one of the priest's places, that I may eat a morsel of bread. In the midst of that darkness, in the midst of even surrounded by this judgment, God speaks in the middle of it and says, I will raise up a priest, and interesting, this language, who is after my own heart. It's the exact same language that God is going to use to speak of the raising and the choosing of David to be his king, who he will raise up, and David will be a king after my own heart. And so God says, in the midst of this collapse, this darkness, the apparent destruction of worship itself in the heart of Israel, I will raise up for myself a priest. Now, I'm at the beginning of this text, over in verse 11, verse 18. Said those ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. Now, Samuel's not a member of Eli's family. He hasn't received kind of the priestly vocation. But the interesting thing that happens, that the text kind of points to, that might be considered kind of a weird little detail, right? That Samuel's wearing a linen ephod. You know who wore linen ephods? Prophets and priests. So already, in the midst of this family where there is rebellion, the turning of worship in on itself, wickedness, already a seed has been planted. Even as God is going to destroy this house, He's planted a seed right in the midst of that house of the one who will be a priest. Priest after God's own heart. One who will be a prophet who speaks only as God speaks. But I actually think this is about more than Samuel. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointing forever. This is about Samuel, but Samuel is a down payment of the coming of our high priest. Prophet, priest, king, Jesus, Son of the living God. Even the collapse of Eli's house, the priesthood, God has planted a seed, and that seed will grow into a tree that is the Son of the living God Himself. One who leads God's people in worship, the one who is and offers the only acceptable sacrifice before the Father, the one who speaks because He actually is the very Word of God. You see, in the midst of this judgment and destruction, God has planted a seed that will live and thrive and grow into a tree. In this tree, all the nations of the earth will be fed. May we tremble before the judgments of God. May we hope in the precious and glorious